Civil rights movement has never been about the many. It's always been about the few. It was not until I enrolled in Mr. Pearson's class at age 11 in 8th grade that I began to understand and wrap my arms around bigotry and racism and segregation and Jim Crow laws. But at the same time, I started to understand the brilliance of many Blacks in American history. It was Negro History Week every day in Mr. Pearson's class. And that made a big difference for me, because now I am discovering the greatness of these Black folk who I've never heard about. He had a slogan that he would always say to us: freedom is not free. If you're not a part of the solution, then you are part of the problem. And then he encouraged us to join the Youth Council NAACP. The membership was $1. So during the summer, we sat in at all of the lunch counters in downtown Jacksonville. The first one was Woolworth's. And we had more than 85 young people that day. Some of the seats were, people were sitting in it, but every vacant seat we sat in. And the white waitress said to us, "You can't sit here. This is for white people. The colored lunch counter is at the back of the store." And we said, "We want to be served." "Well, we don't serve Negroes here. You can be served in the back." So the manager came out, his name was James Word, and he read a card. And after he read us the card, he closed the lunch counter. So then whites stood behind us yelling the racial epithets: jungle bunny, niggers, niggers ain't acting like colored people for the NAACP. So we always sat longer than lunchtime because we figured that they served fresh lunches. There were no microwaves, no convection ovens. So if you wanted your racism, we wanted to make it as expensive as possible. So we sat longer than the lunchtime. We saw no police the entire time. We later found out that police were there in plain clothes because they were taking pictures of all of us. You would think the slogan "to protect and serve" would mean something. It did not mean anything when it came to those of us who were sitting in. As we have seen in sit-in demonstrations, Jim Clark, Bull Connor, they did not care about your age. They cared less than a tinker's damn about who you were, male or female, young or old. If your hue of skin was Black, then whatever you got, you deserved it. The end of that week was August 27th. Pearson got a call from, he never did tell us who he got the call from, but got a call saying, and his word to us was, there was some strange goings on at Hemming Park. So when he got down to Hemming Park, there were white males in Confederate uniforms handing out axe handles. So when we had our meeting that morning at the Lyre Street Presbyterian Church Youth Center, Mr. Pearson told us what was going on. And Mr. Pearson's words were, "Something could happen today." We proceeded anyway. It was healthy fear, but it was determined courage. And we sat in. We did not go to Woolworth that day. We went to Grant's, which was on the corner of Adams and Main. And again, they closed the lunch counter. So as we walked out of Grant's and turned west on Adams Street, I got this panorama. I saw a guy up on top of a truck with his camera, and I heard the commotion and saw people in the distance running down Adams Street. and couldn't quite visualize what was happening. Then I saw the guy on top of the truck with the camera knocked off of the truck by somebody swinging something. And in a short period of time, we realized this was a mob and they were coming for us. Stores there on Adams Street started locking their doors. Our only option was to run to get out of danger. I ran down Main Street. Somebody picked me up and took me to the Laura Street Presbyterian Church Youth Center. And slowly members of the youth council started coming back, crying. The rumors started flying. Somebody got killed, somebody got beat up. 2 patrolmen from the sheriff's department showed up. They said they wanted to talk to us. But the pastor was there, Wilbert Miller. Reverend Miller, who was the pastor of the Presbyterian Church, was about 5'7". And Reverend Miller looking up at the patrolman from 5'7" to 6'1" or whatever the guy was, saying, "You will not set foot on church property." And they didn't. We had a press conference at the home of a Black doctor, Dr. James Henderson. He was a dentist. And from there, we planned a mass meeting at St. Paul AME Church at the corner of 13th and Myrtle. We'd also heard that the Klan was going to march in the Black community that night. So there were Blacks sitting inside their cars with guns and rifles in case the Klan decided they wanted to come down Myrtle Avenue. We had reporters from all over the country. St. Paul AME Church looked like an international press conference. So we announced the boycott of the Times Union, announced the boycott of downtown Jacksonville. But we went down to Woolworth's 5 days in a row to the white lunch counter. And Marjorie and I ate at the white lunch counter for 5 days in a row. And after those 5 days, all of the lunch counters in downtown Jacksonville were integrated. Civil rights movement has always been about we and us, not me and I. So everything we were able to do, we were able to do it for those folk who look like us. And as long as we are fighting racism and fighting for Black human dignity and respect, the struggle continues, and the struggle is not in vain.
Good morning and welcome to the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known, Overturning the Southern Strategy. There are hundreds of bills. In fact, the Brennan Center says there are currently, this year alone, 177 bills that are floating around to restrict voting and various other civil rights, which are being introduced throughout the country in state houses. As we saw in Tennessee as well, the effort to overturn even what the electorate wants continues in the United States. Republican supermajorities commonly challenge the process and express concern about what they call election integrity. Well, as you saw in the film, Rodney Hurst Sr. declared that as long as we are fighting racism and fighting for Black human dignity and respect, the struggle continues, and the struggle is not in vain. Is a shift in cultural or societal attitudes as important as policy shifts? Well, we're going to discuss Rodney Hurst in another panel, an all-star panel is what I call it this morning. But first, a couple of news items. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg is suing House Judiciary Chairman Jim Jordan over what the lawsuit filed yesterday described as a transparent campaign to intimidate and attack his office's case against former President Donald Trump. The suit injects more legal drama into Bragg's investigation of the former president, which has been dogged for weeks by accusations from Republicans that the prosecutor's pursuit of Trump was purely political, with the claims being central to Jordan's own probe. They want him to reveal any evidence that he has against Donald Trump. They want to put that evidence on trial in Congress, and Bragg has fought against it. A U.S. district judge, though, has denied Bragg's request for emergency relief to block his testimony in Congress later this month. So we'll continue to watch that. Also, the Shelby County Board of Commission is scheduled to vote at 1:30 p.m. today on whether to reappoint or reseat Representative Justin Pearson in Tennessee. According to the chairman, Mikhail Lowry, he said Pearson's expulsion was conducted in a hasty manner without consideration of other consequences. However, unlike Justin Jones, who unanimously was returned to his seat, 4 of the county's 13 commissioners have indicated they will not vote to reseat Pearson. One commissioner said that they are concerned that such a vote would bring repercussions, including loss of state fundings to the city. So we're going to monitor that today. The vote is scheduled to take place at 1:30 this afternoon Eastern Time. Overt intentional racial discrimination still exists in America today. That is not breaking news, right? But we don't have schools and restaurants segregated by law. At its core, today's movement is fighting systemic racism. Black people get lower pay on average compared with other Americans. They are more likely to be killed by police. And today's challenges, well, they aren't necessarily harder than defeating Jim Crow, but they are certainly more complicated. We discussed that with Rodney Hurst Sr., the author of Axe Handle Saturday, a book turned documentary about the race riot in Jacksonville, Florida. We also have Sundiata Cha-Jua, an associate professor of African American Studies, and History at the University of Illinois, and of course, our friend Dr. David Childs, a historian and Black Studies scholar at Northern Kentucky University. Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good to see each and every one of you. Again, we see what's going on in Tennessee. We see what's obviously going on all the time in Florida. Here's a question, and we'll start with Rodney Hurst Sr. Is a shift in cultural or society attitudes as important as policy shifts?
Well, basically, what we are seeing in America today is really no change in the respect that America has now and has had for Black folk since the founding of this country. American history is incomplete, dishonest, and racist. Any country that is founded on enslaving a race of people because they look different, and to justify the enslavement, you consider those Black hue of skin persons as property to get around the teachings of Jesus Christ and to get around the biblical teachings for those who are Christians. So you treat us with you treated us with the kind of disrespect that you would have for a broom or a chair or a piece of linen somewhere. So as we evolve from this time, from the time that slavery was over and white America basically said you are free, but with nothing, then we were expected 158 years ago to make things work when we had no money, no property, yet we had made America obscenely wealthy. And from there, we go to the nadir of race relations as called by Dr. Rayford Logan and my good friend, the late Dr. Jim Lowen. We have evolved to this period of social media where many blacks from the integration generation are looking at racism for the first time.
And so, with that in mind, Sundiata, let me turn it over to you as well. We know that, for instance, in the 60s, Black people were terrorized by police, as we saw in the film there, but we see it in so many other places. And in most cases, they were white-led, like Bull Connor, right? But in Memphis, Tyree Nichols was killed by Black officers who reported to a Black police chief. Talk about today, and as far as the Jim Crow laws that we saw, kind of put it in context with today.
Well, let me start by saying that we're constantly dealing with two contradictions. The first contradiction is that white people's wealth, power, and liberty is built on the basis of the impoverishment, the powerlessness, and the oppression of Black people. And the second contradiction is that despite the constant change, and our condition in this society does constantly change, but we remain in the same position at the bottom. And what this has meant is that in this new era, coming out of the 60s, the advances made by the civil rights and Black power movements positioned Black people to gain political leadership of large cities. And the first thing Black mayors did, right, in responding to our people's cries, was to appoint a Black police chief and begin to put more Black people in the police departments. But over time, what has happened is that those Black folks have become more blue than Black.
Mm-hmm.
So we're now in an era where adding Black people to a police department does not fundamentally change the nature of the police and the role that they play in society. You know, that slogan that was pointed out in the clips of the documentary on Axe Handle Saturday, police protect and serve. Yes, they protect and serve the rich and the white, but in the Black community, they brutalize and oppress. And we're now at that moment where race doesn't matter that much, right? It's not that it doesn't mean anything, but it doesn't matter that much in policing.
Well, Dr. Childs, one Florida activist said that we used to have water hoses. We used to have Jim Crow and segregation laws. But Ron DeSantis is now using the word woke and his Southern strategy, and it's hard to combat. What makes DeSantis so hard to combat, Dr. Childs?
I don't think that DeSantis is hard to combat.
Well, let me grab Dr. Childs on that. We can come back to you, Sundiata.
As clearly a racist as anyone in the last 30 years, right? Reagan, you can go on and on. Now, what he does is simply changes the language, but that was always the argument of the Southern strategy, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, and this is why
there's the advisor to Ronald Reagan once said that in the 60s you start off by saying the N-word, right? He said by the time you get into the 90s and the 2000s, you are now saying protect the rights of white people.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've simply changed the language, and it's somewhat milder, but DeSantis is ratcheting up where he's making it very clear to us that his agenda is the elimination of Black history from public schooling. Mm-hmm. His agenda is a return of Black people to the 1950s era and before 55, before we're on the march and really fighting back. He wants to take us back in time to where white supremacy reigned
that seems to be the strategy of the Republican Party as a whole.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Childs, how do you combat that, Dr. Childs?
Well, education is so important, and making sure that we are getting access to the curriculum. That's why we recently we're in the middle of the fight of making African American history AP history, and there's some resistance to that. But it does happen in the schools, and making sure that people understand the importance of African American history. And it's not just an afterthought. It's not just a clause in the textbook, but making sure that people understand that it is a part of our history as well. It is not, and it's not just for Black folks. African American history is for all people. there's been this narrative that we are just teaching African American history for people of color, and that's their history. The real important history is George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, etc., and so forth, and that's inaccurate. And folks like DeSantis and our past president has used dog whistle tactics, and of course the Southern strategy to get their base stirred up. So we have to combat that. There's a campaign of misinformation. 45 was a master at the campaign on misinformation. So okay, I'll talk more. I get excited.
Dr. Childs was on the road. But let me ask, let me throw this out to you. You have for a time Democrats controlling all three branches of government, and at one time controlling many of the state houses and governorship. So is this really a matter of one party over the other? Because it seems African Americans have gotten the short end of the stick, regardless of who is in control.
You're absolutely right in raising that question, that neither party is a party for us. So we need to be clear on that. But that's not to erase differences between the parties. If you look at the states that Republicans have control of the legislature, and if you look at Republican governors, those 36 states that they control, you see very clearly that the legislation that they are putting out is far more aggressive in its anti-Blackness. One could say that in the states that Democrats control, there has been some movement in the direction of our interests, but not nearly to the degree that it ought to be, right? What I like to say is this: the Democrats are doing very little to help us, but the Republicans are trying to kill us.
And Mr. Hurst, you tackle a lot of this, of course, in the film that we see, but it's becoming clear, as we already discussed this morning, that the GOP is challenging everything, the electoral process. They're challenging all rights. I saw the other day Governor Gavin Newsom of California talk about how things are scary. And now this is a white man in power saying how things are scary, that the shifting culture basically wanted to take us back. We're talking about Jim Crow, take us back to Jim Crow. So the question is whether states with Republican supermajorities will follow Tennessee's lead in expelling opponents with different points of view.
Of course they would, and I don't expect them to do anything less than that. They have gerrymandered their state legislative districts and congressional districts just to make sure they stay in power. And what has happened is there are buzzwords that DeSantis uses that is also a part of the Southern strategy, and that is, we don't want white folk to feel guilty and uncomfortable. What they have done in the state of Florida, they have redesignated the name of librarians to media specialists, and they have the responsibility to vet all books to make sure there's nothing in those books that make white folk feel guilty and uncomfortable. If it does, then the books are banned. And if a teacher is caught with one of those books, either in a classroom library or in the school, they are subject to a Class 3 felony in the state of Florida, which is in the same category of carjacking, prostitution, selling drugs. But understand that what white racist elected officials do today is that they plug into the river of racism that has been flowing in this country consistently. If I ask most folk, where did Ronald Reagan launch his presidential campaign? Many would not tell me in Philadelphia, Mississippi, who prior to the 3 civil rights workers being killed, no one outside of Mississippi basically had heard of Philadelphia, Mississippi. But he launched his campaign there to to really send a red meat foghorn to white racists, telling them the Republican Party is where you should be. And that's what we are seeing happening today. Racism is consistent, and it is also cyclical when it comes to some of the major issues. And what we're seeing now is one of the cycles. The problem is that young people today, the millennials and this integration generation, are hearing and seeing racism for the first time, and it is hitting them right between the eyes, and they've never been exposed to it before, and they don't know what to do.
Well, it's interesting, Sundiata, that great points brought up by Rodney Hurst there, going back to Ronald Reagan and Philadelphia, Mississippi. So we talked a lot about on this program about how Republicans strategize, not just for the short term, but they play the long game. And when we saw that happening, you think back to when that happened, and now you think about today as to where we are now, as you stated already, they are really looking to turn this thing back to Jim Crow at the least, slavery certainly not far behind.
Well, you know, it's clear that the Republican Party is the party of white supremacy. So that party pursues in a legislative way the goals of white supremacist organizations. The Democratic Party does not pursue the interests of Black people, right? So we have to begin to find other means to pursue our interests, and we got to be very, very clear. We can't simply play defense. We have to play offense. And what I mean by that is this. In my state, Illinois, and I would recommend this for all the other states in which there are Democratic governors, there's Democratic control of the legislature. In our state, the representatives from Champaign, Carol Amons, and the state senator from this area, Paul Faraci, they put forward a bill saying that any library that receives state funds cannot ban books, right? There can be no banning of books. And so we've got to play offense in those states where we have influences, in those cities where we have control or a lot of influence. We have to be very, very clear in pushing an agenda to ensure that the DeSantis, we got to build a wall in terms of the spread of DeSantis's policies. And in the southern states where it's spreading, and in certain Midwest states, we've got to also go after DeSantis, make him and his policies the focal point of a national Black movement to push it back. And that's what we're trying to do in the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And that involves building freedom schools. It involves organizing at every level, right, with unions across the sector to push back against these right-wing policies and to put forward more progressive policies. That's the war that we got to level. We got to fight. It's going to have to be in the streets in terms of demonstrations and protests. It's going to have to be organizing in the schools and the educational arena and in our churches, and using the institutions that we control, our institutions, to put back into our people the kind of consciousness that we had in a previous year when we were able to eliminate these apartheid strategies and practices.
And we've gotten too comfortable. Black folk, after the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64, the Voting Rights Acts in 65 and 68, many even in the Civil Rights Movement felt like the fight was over. That struggle had concluded and there was no need to continue to fight. The only difference is that racism just changed the rules of the game, and they continued to do what that disrespect that they had started from the founding of this country. And we have to say that. We have to, you don't want me to talk about how your ancestors treated my ancestors because it makes you feel guilty and uncomfortable. Yet my ancestors made this country obscenely wealthy and started capitalism as we know it in this country. There is a reason why many of these Ivy League colleges are now discovering that their presidents owned enslaved persons and that they have taken money, tens of millions of dollars. Two schools, Harvard and Georgetown, have put $100 million in an escrow account to deal with some of the past sins. But that's admitting your guilt and the fact that you disrespected my ancestors.
A lot of this is based on misinformation as well. This notion that CRT, I saw in the sign there, they're still pushing forth this misinformation that critical race theory is taking over our schools, and that teachers are that quote unquote woke teachers are infiltrating our schools and teaching white people not to like themselves and love themselves. That's based on misinformation. First of all, of course, we know they don't even know what critical race theory is. But there's these dog whistle tactics. I was saying this earlier, promoting fear, and that's the base. That's the base of people like DeSantis to stoke the fires of fear and get them in a frenzy without even really understanding what's going on. This is a campaign for information, re-education. That's why I like what Assoc is doing and empowering these young folks and giving them educating them on what's really going on, and even tapping into white allies. There's a lot of young whites that are being indoctrinated. They're saying that we're indoctrinating, but they're really indoctrinating with their campaigns of ignorance. And they know that if we get people out voting, that they're going to get these folks out of office. We have to get the youth vote, get the black vote out. Economics, even having our own, promoting black businesses, reparations, those kinds of things will be empowering. I'm in Kentucky right now, and I mentioned earlier, we, to a certain extent, we take our playbook from Florida. There was legislation introduced into fortunately some of it didn't pass, but they were trying to go after professors, even at the professor level, teaching critical race theory and trying to monitor what we're doing in our classrooms, even as tenure faculty. They're going after tenure in Kentucky. And so these kinds of things are disturbing, but we're not going to put our head in the sand. We're going to mobilize. We're going to educate. We're going to keep going. And just because, and people don't understand, just because there's not a cross burning every other day, there's not fire hoses, we are still, our civil rights are still under attack. And white supremacy doesn't always necessarily mean, even though we've had racist groups come on our campus, for example, in Northern Kentucky University, doesn't always mean, it's not always overt, but it's like critical race theory talks about microaggressions. And white supremacy is this notion that white people know best. They can tell us how we feel. They can tell us how we feel. They can tell black and brown folks what we should be doing, and give us placate us with positions where they can control us. But we don't need to be controlled. We can speak for ourselves.
Yeah, Sundiata, a decade ago, a quote leaderful movement in which power was more distributed. They do not want the entire movement to suffer too much if one individual had a personal scandal or was killed. And they viewed organizations like the Urban League as too slow moving and tied to the traditional political establishment. Is this approach good or bad today?
I would say that to the extent that that approach picked up some ideas from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and that it was seeking to develop something that wasn't a top-down leadership, I would say that theoretically it was good. But in terms of what actually happened is that we ended up with not leadership, which was the goal, right? A group of leaders as opposed to one leader. We ended up with no one steering the car. And so in that sense, it turned out not to be a good idea. But the problem is deeper than just a flawed conceptualization of leadership. The problem really gets to how do you build membership? How do you build a social movement that is actually rooted in our people if it doesn't come out of the institutions that we control. You see, this last upsurge was more media generated, whether we're talking social media or mainstream media, then it was generated out of the institutions of the Black community. Now, here's where the right-wing movement, the conservatives, stole and borrowed our strategies and tactics from the 60s. The last high tide of the Black liberation movement was the Black Power movement, right? They borrowed our strategies and tactics and they went local. And so they emphasized things like school boards, library boards, local elections, township, and they built up a bench of leaders through that movement, through that local movement. We are not trying, we're focused on the big offices, right? We're turning out for the presidential election, but we've got to build a base. They mobilize their religious constituency, the right-wing, racist evangelicals. The Black church has not made its presence felt since the death of Martin Luther King, virtually, right? So we've got to take our institutions, our civic organizations have to begin to get engaged in advocacy. They got to join with the Black liberation movement organizations to push this. We need a strategy as a people to push forward. And whether that means, you can't just have one leader. Every time we've had a predominant leader, something has indeed been done to them. Not something happened, something was done to them, right? So we know that we need leadership and we have to develop strong leadership. The goal of SNCC was to come in, get the people engaged, get them involved, and then those organizers who come in can leave. But I took away from Rodney's, the clip on the documentary, two things stood out to me. One, he talked about mass movement, that there would be the mass meeting. The mass meetings were the key to us building the civil rights movement and Black Power movements, right? Because you got as many other community people who wanted to be engaged in there. You used the culture to get them engaged and get them, energized and emotional. And then Rodney talked about getting out there and getting engaged directly into action, right? So that we have to learn that we've got to go back to those mass meetings, building that strategy to get people engaged. And then we have to have a strategy of drawing on our institutions to help guide us in this struggle. And it does have to be multifaceted. There will not be one leader.
Right. And so with that said, I want to lift up Bobby Henry's comment from the West Side Gazette. Bobby says, there's nothing new under the sun. We can go back to 1920 to Daytona Beach with Harry T. and Harriet Moore. He said the events that occurred there when people were killed for trying to gain the right to vote. He said there's nothing new. What is new is that our fight is weak. Dr. Childs, is the fight weak or is it that there are too many distractions that are placed before folks like the Black Lives Matters movement and other activist groups?
The fight is not weak. The players are still there. There's not the unity that we need. And I like what Dr. Sundiata was saying in terms of we don't just need one leader. We need multifaceted leaders, and we need to understand. He said something that I always say. When we think about voting, when we think about elections, we always focus on the national election. But a lot of the power is in the local elections, the primaries. And you talk to young people today, you talk to the Black community, when they are involved politically, they wait till there's a national election. But the power is in those local elections, city council, school board. I'm working with a community near me in Ohio that they have an all-white city council. They have a 20 or 30% Black population. They have no representation. They have a one Black person on school board. The whole police force is all white. That's the local election. Even the school board selects, in many cases, the superintendent. And the superintendent's going to be setting the policy. They're the ones that can dictate what books come into the community. They're the one that can authorize African American AP. courses. They're the ones that can make African American courses a requirement, or they can do the opposite. They can teach they can make sure a whitewashed curriculum is pushed forth. And so we need to understand, in terms of being strong, our strength is in our power to vote in democracy. Our strength is in educating the youth. The youth, one of the things I appreciated about the video is the youth involvement, and the work that Rodney Hurst has done is they were involved as young people,
Right.
and that should remind us in the work that Rutledge Pearson did. They should be involved early on. We look at young people as children. We look at the middle school and high school, but let's remember a lot of the movement were the youth, and they need to understand they can learn this history. They can learn their process. They can learn their vote. One thing that learn their power to vote, and let me add this: one thing that is weak is we don't understand the power of what I call black economics. I got that from my friend. We don't understand the power of economics in our community, the power of the boycott. We want to continue to support Nike. We want to continue to buy our Jordans. But if we got really serious and begin to boycott businesses and raise our own businesses and highlight black banks, and everything from lawn care companies to investors and consultants that are African American, if we begin to do that, we can hurt them. And so we are weak in that area. We don't understand the power of the boycott. And there's some strategies we can borrow from the civil rights movement. There's some things we can evolve on.
Well, Mr. Hurst, I want to go back to Rodney Hurst Sr. You mentioned in the film, if you wanted your racism, you wanted to make it as expensive as possible. Do you see that same attitude today?
Unfortunately, no, because black folk have gotten much too comfortable. I call it comfort speak.
Mm.
In this integration generation, we go wherever we want to go, do what we want to do, sleep who we want to sleep with. And that's very comfortable for black folk. And if you start standing up for who you are, then that makes white folk uncomfortable. And so we are afraid many times if we talk about black history, we talk about the uncomfortability of America's incomplete, racist, and dishonest American history, that would make white folk uncomfortable. I had the honor to be the keynote speaker when Harry T. Moore and Harriet Moore were inducted in the Florida Civil Rights Hall of Fame. Both of them are my heroes. And understand that that was not an isolated assassination. Vernon Dahmer in Mississippi was also killed because he advocated voter registration for blacks. One of the missing ingredients today is that back then we had the black press. I had the occasion to meet Tres Van Anderson, who was an absolute icon in black media, but with the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, Jet Ebony, Amsterdam News, they were the ones who really covered the civil rights movement because white media had no black reporters. And some of the first black reporters were just black parrots mouthing the words of some of their racist colleagues. And we have to understand there is no objectivity in the media. And we have to learn how to get on some of these black folk who are working in media. You don't have to be an advocate for me. I don't want you to say anything like I would say it, but at least have some insight in the truth, which we have very little of today when it comes to the media.
Well, and you still have the black press, as Benny Thompson said a couple of weeks ago during the State of the Black Press. He was very, very candid. He said, had it not been for the black press, a lot of the lies of the previous administration would not have been exposed. He credited the black press with exposing all of that. I want to ask Sundiata, Daniela Pierre writes in, I'm reading her comments. She says that folks can't show up if they're paid by the oppressor. We, back in the civil rights movement, we know there were infiltrators or traitors who were Black. We see that today. And this is what Daniela appears to be getting at as well.
I appreciate the sentiment that Daniela is expressing, but I think that it's an overstatement, because at the end of the day, Black businesses don't employ even 6% of the African American population. So we are all working for the oppressor. Now, here's the thing, right? Most Black people, we disproportionately work for government, state, local, and federal. And that's a consequence of the success of the civil rights movement, right? That we open up those government jobs. But I don't want to, just stay on that. I want to shift a little bit and make a point, building on the last things that Mr. Hurst said. Rodney was speaking to the ways in which things had actually changed. And I think if we're going to talk about history and the theory of history at its most basic, right, is that everything does change. Amiri Baraka, the great poet and movement leader and theorist, he had an analysis of Black music, and he called it the changing sane. And I think that that's the metaphor for understanding our conditions. Things are constantly changing. One of the reasons we're not as equipped, our young people, for the battle ahead as we were in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right, is because the Black community was more cohesive, and was cohesive both in terms of space, territory, the quote unquote so-called ghetto. We controlled the institutions there. I should say the institutions that we built, we controlled, right? We're more concentrated. There was less class division, I should say class stratification amongst our people. And so it was easier to coalesce and unite. Today, that's very different, right? We're a plurality of us live in suburbs, albeit many of them are Black suburbs. We're being pushed out of the cities. And so we're not as cohesive in terms of space as we were. The Black press is not as powerful as it was. Black talent now seems to want to run to white institutions and corporations. So some of our most talented people are taking those skills to white media, right? And so these are changes. These are different than the past environment.
Well, they in the civil rights movement too, Sundiata, it was the white media who was infiltrating the Black press, trying to steal the talent from the Black press, right?
Well, they've been successful. And the point is that until we adopt as an overall strategy that we have to rebuild the institutional infrastructure of the Black community so that we have to begin to think of ourselves as a nation of people, and we have to begin to build institutions that serve our people. And at that point, we can be much more successful in reflecting the negativity from white America and in pushing through and achieving what are our basic human rights within this society. But if we're not organized and have strong institutions that socialize our children, that socialize our people in the sense that we are worthy, beautiful, wonderful people who have contributed to humanity, going back eons. If we're not able to do that, there's very little that we're going to be successful at. So I just think we got to rethink the strategy.
Yeah, and Dr. Childs, how do we get that back? We again, Sundiata really laid out the community situation, the Black community, what it used to be and what it's not now. We talked about the Black press. The Black press certainly is still here, 196 years strong, but it needs that support from other Black people, right?
Yes. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm not as I think it's more hopeful than others might think. We see pockets of this. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go. For example, something that the good Dr. Sundiata brought up is the Black church. In my own community, we have a ministerial alliance. And there's a whole tradition, as we know, there's a whole tradition, a long tradition of Black ministers. They were Antonio Gramsci talks about the organic intellectuals. The Black ministers, I'm a clergy myself. Black ministers have been the organic intellectuals. In other words, they've had their ear to the ground. Of course, we see a lot of ministers that are co-opted by capitalism and by the legacy of white supremacy. But I see a lot of good things going on in the Black church. There've been some in my own community. There's been some get out the vote campaigns that's been spearheaded by the Black community. I want to go back to education. Schools have always been the battleground, and once again, we see schools being the battleground. We need to empower teachers, especially Black and brown teachers. There's an effort too to diversify the teaching field. Of course, we know skin folks ain't always kin folks, but by and large, if we diversify the teaching field and we empower these teachers and help them know their rights, build our teachers unions and strengthen them and not let the unions be co-opted, because many times the strength of the union depends on what school district you're in. But those teacher unions are really, really important. And so there's a couple of, let me just say this again, the Black churches, especially like Baptist Black churches, because they're independent. These independent Black church movements, really, really important in the schools as well. And getting the youth empowered, because a lot of the youth are apathetic. They don't think that their voice matters. But my goodness, some of these local elections, they could be swayed with 30 votes. And that could make the difference of how funding is distributed, who gets grants, etc., and so forth.
And let me throw this question out to each of you. It's being raised by Michelle Madison, but I'm gonna put a different look on that question. Well, she says, let me say what she says, and then I'll ask it this way. She says, why is the LGBTQ movement compared to the Black movement? She wanted your thoughts, but I'm gonna use that as a springboard to my question, which I think she's alluding to, is it that today we do take on other causes when our cause, it seems, the cause for Black civil rights, has not been met? We see, the Stop Asian Hate. These are great causes, right? But it seems that we adopt them as well. But it doesn't seem, and again, I want you guys to discuss this. You're the historians, you're the experts. It doesn't seem like we get that same allyship, if that's a word.
Can I start off? Every time something is Black, for example, in the university world, anytime you have a Black studies movement and there's a funding, we have a Black studies presence on campus. If there's a funding deficit, often they will cut Black studies. And because of the legacy of white supremacy, legacy of racism in this country, people are afraid of words like Black, African American, anti-racist discourse. And it's always been co-opted by LGBTQ, by other movements. And it's not that we have true allyship. It's power sharing. True allyship is not tapped down telling Black folks what to do. You guys don't need reparations. You guys are just complaining. You just want to make white people feel bad. That's not true allyship. And I'm all about unity, especially being a pastor. But I'm not about, for example, in the church setting, all the Black folks sit down while there's white leadership, and we may get to be on the praise team. We might get to be the youth leader, but we can't be at the very top. That's a metaphor I like to use to talk about often how it's disseminated to us. We have to sit back, but how long? How long do we have to sit back and wait? It's about people don't want to share power. That's what's going on. They don't want to give up power.
Well,
and so,
Mr. Hurst and Sundiata, Dr. Sundiata, we have about 2.5 minutes left. I want you guys to tackle that question. Either one of you can go first.
Real quick, and before I get to that, I just want to say something about about Black ministers. I am disappointed in Black ministers because they are not doing what they need to do from their pulpits. In Montgomery, Alabama, one of the real unsung heroes was a guy named Edgar Daniel Nixon. And he asked Martin Luther King to head up the Montgomery Improvement Association because he said all of the ministers in Montgomery were tainted by the white power structure. So that's one key thing that we need to do. But when it comes to a movement, no other people in the history of this country have been discriminated against based on the color of their skin. LGBTQ plus, you don't know they're LGBTQ, many of them, based on how they look, because they are in many instances white. To me, that movement is a movement for me of equality. I will support any movement of others who have been discriminated against, but don't couch what you say when you need to support the Black movement because it sounds too incriminating that it might make other white folk think that you are a traitor by supporting whites, supporting Blacks. I think what we need to do is, number one, be brave about what we do and make sure that our voices are heard.
You know, I would add to that at the simplest in answer to the question, the LGBTQ movement is compared to the Black Liberation Movement because they are both social movements. They are both movements of people who suffered different forms of oppression. The solution is not to turn on those other movements, and they're going to borrow from us. We're the most successful social movement in the history of this country. We have reshaped this country several times, right? But it always returns to its racist core. So what we have to talk about, and this is what I want to just say, the notion of allyship is deeply problematic because what allies are individuals that support your cause. That's not what we need. We need people in other movements who are pushing it back against this racist, capitalist, homophobic, sexist society that can have an agenda that aligns with portion of our agendas, and then we can create solidarity. We don't need people just supporting us. We need them moving against the system because of their interests, right? We need labor saying we want fair wages, and we're going to make sure that the Black people who are associated with labor get fair wages. We need LGBTQ movement saying that they're not going to discriminate on the basis of race and ethnicity within their movement, right? And within hiring. That's what we need is solidarity amongst these groups and not think of it as friendship, because we're not trying to be friends with folk. We're trying to improve the quality of life of our people. We're trying to liberate African people wherever they are. And that's the position I think we need to take. And when we sit down with these folk, we need to negotiate as two different social movements, negotiating an alliance.
Yeah. Dr. Sundiata Cha-Jua, Associate Professor of African American Studies and History at the University of Illinois, Dr. David Childs, a historian and Black Studies scholar at Northern Kentucky University, and Rodney Hurst Sr., the author of Axe Handle Saturday, a book-turned-documentary about the race riot in Jacksonville, Florida. Wish we had more time for this discussion. We really appreciate the discussion, and thank you all for joining Let It Be Known. We'll see you again tomorrow.